So my name's Daniel. The next 50 minutes, we're going to be looking at something called thinking fast and slow with software development. So it comes from this awesome book I read a few years ago. It's not my book. It's by Daniel Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize winner, so it's like super awesome book, definitely building on his work. Out of curiosity, has anyone read the book? Ah, brilliant, so like a handful of people, cool. I will say I'm probably not going to do it full justice, because Daniel Kahneman spent years doing this work, but what I'm trying to do today is to make it approachable. I think it's a book everyone should read, but as software developers, it was initially a bit hard for me and my team to get into, but once we got into it, it was really beneficial. The key takeaways really today are these things. As humans, our decision-making can be flawed, and we don't realize that sometimes. Just look at the kind of decisions being made in the world now, in the UK and the US, you know, these kind of things as well. Keep it topical. Applying process and models as appropriate overcomes some of those issues, yeah? Collaborating more and better is super important. I'm going to say it a few times, but writing or creating software is inherently a collaborative act, but at times, and even myself, at times, we like to do our individual thing. So it's a constant balance. We need to do this kind of plan, do, check, act, build, measure, learn, pretty much the scientific method, yeah? We need to make sure we increment sort of what we're doing and constantly iterate, constantly learn. Very quickly, this is me hailing from the UK. I am a native English speaker, so if I speak a bit too fast, apologize, but maybe put your hand up and let me know. Always a challenge for me. I work as a consultant all over the world, in Europe, in the US as well. Definitely my background comes from development, in particular Java development, but these days I do a lot of architecture, a lot of leadership, some business stuff as well. I love giving back to the community. I've taken so much from open source and from websites. I try and give back as much as I can these days. Feel free to tweet at me, at Daniel Bryant UK. Love getting involved in a good Twitter rant. So I'm going to assume most of you are developers, QA, architect type people. People, you know, hands-on kind of thing, yeah? It's very easy to look at our managers and think they do silly things, yeah? You know, here's Dilbert giving all the work, and then the bosses have the kind of easy thing to do, and they make all the mistakes, yeah? But in reality, it's us making mistakes as engineers, as quality assurance people as well. Daniel Kahneman, in his book, posited these two models of the way we make decisions. There's system one in our brain, which is fast, it's instinctive, it's emotional, and it's subconscious. It's basically here in your brainstem. It was, in evolutionary terms, the first part of the brain that developed. It's called the reptilian brain, the lizard brain, something like that. System two is the neocortex up the front here, and it's the slower, deliberate, kind of more reasoning-based thinking center, and it's the bit you identify as you know, your consciousness, that little voice you probably hear. Hopefully you don't hear multiple voices. That's not a good sign, but one voice is good. As a quick demo of this, then this is just a model, and like all models, they're kind of wrong, but they're useful, yeah? So, quick demo of this. I'm going to show you two calculations on the screen. Try and do them in your head, and watch what happens, yeah? Two calculations, do them in your head, watch your thinking process. First calculation. Second calculation. Fundamentally, same answer. But did you notice, like at the top one, 2 plus 2, like that? It was a system one event. Your brain saw the pattern, it recognized the pattern, jumped to the answer. The second one, you had to engage in effort. You were like, 24 divided by 2, then I multiply. You had to kick system 2 into gear. Does that make sense? And it kind of, on some biological level, your blood pressure might have gone up, your pupils might have dilated. That's not a difficult problem. But in IT, we have difficult problems all the time. Classic is optical illusions as well. So here, you might see two faces, or a vase, or a kind of container. And you see one thing instinctively, and the other, when I tell you it's there, you can see both things. System one, system two. Now, this is after lunch, so I'm going to get you a little bit of audience participation. I'm going to ask a question and give you three options. Who thinks the top line's bigger, the bottom line's bigger, or they're both the same size? So, audience participation, who thinks the top line is bigger? Couple people, good stuff. Who thinks the bottom line is bigger? A few people, sort of half, yeah. Who thinks they're both the same size? Vast majority of the audience, yeah. So, I've actually tricked you, and the top line is bigger, right? That's a System 1 event, yeah? You thought, oh, I know the answer, he's trying to trick me. And I was, but in a different way. Your System 1 got in the way, and you jumped to conclusions, yeah? So this is the thing. System 1, it's awesome, yeah? But it's rapid, it's associative, and it has systemic errors. This kind of stuff happens, as much as we're having a joke here, it happens all the time in IT in my day-to-day work as a consultant. System 2 is lazy. You have to kick it into gear. As I mentioned before, you have to engage System 2 to get the benefits of System 2. It's causal and it's not statistical, yeah? So we've transmitted a lot of our knowledge through the ages in terms of stories. So that's the best way to transmit knowledge to humans, stories rather than stats. Our brain has a hard time with stats sometimes. So let's look at some heuristics and biases affecting software delivery, yeah? The first one is the availability heuristic, and it says if something can be recalled, it must be important. I call this hipsteritis. I don't know if it translates over here in Latvia, but if I was to ask you, what's the best architectural style now? Someone shout out what they think of the best or the most sort of current hipster architectural style is. It depends, awesome, but I heard microservices as well, yeah. So microservices, and I'm guilty as charged as well. I write a lot of articles on microservices. They're kind of the current flavor of the month, yeah? And it's a bit of a vicious or virtuous circle, whatever you want to say. The bandwagon effect kicks into gear. People jump on board. They want to be part of the trend. And again, guilty as charged sometimes, yeah? Have we found the silver bullet? As you know, anyone saw Paul Stack talk earlier on, we know from Fred Brooks that there is no silver bullet in IT, yeah? And microservices have a lot of benefits, but they're not right for everyone. And with anything, it depends, basically. It does come with trade-offs, yeah? The problem is, whatever's available triggers your mind. So when all you have is a hammer, the saying is, everything looks like a nail. Make sense? When all you have is a service-oriented architecture, everything looks like a service, yeah? And, throughout, I think, IT, no one's really, everyone's kind of involved in this. I think in the operations world, when all you have is a Jenkins, everything looks like a Jenkins job. Yeah, I've worked on a few of those gigs before. So is it Java people in the audience? I'm a Java person, like Spring people. Yeah, awesome. Marcin's doing his talk at the same time, so I did this deliberately for Marcin. But when all you have is a Java Spring framework, everything looks like an abstract singleton proxy factory bean. Yeah. So I love Spring. Yeah, I do a lot of Spring. But do you get my point? As in, we kind of whatever's available, we dive into. Yeah. We need to stop and think professionally. That's the key message. Stop and engage System 1. If you're a Spring shop, just choosing to use Spring for your next project is probably a System 1 event. We always do Spring. But stop, think about the trade-offs. Spike, prototype, experiment, evaluate. These things are super, super important. And we must convince management of the benefit of those things. Constant learning, super important again. Finding trusted mentors has been a big part, sort of a big plus point of my career. I was very lucky. My first gig was working for the UK government, and I met two amazing contractors that set the standards for me and how my career developed. They took the time to address everyone courteously. They were diligent in their work. They paid back to the community, they wrote books, they did presentations, and I basically have copied what they've done. So mentors, super important. Do by all means read blogs as well. Blogs are super useful, but I think we should be reading more books. Yeah, I think books are an underutilized form of knowledge these days, and writing a book takes a bit more time, and a bit more thought process often goes into it. So don't just be hitting Hacker News. I love Hacker News, yeah, but mix it up with some reading of books as well. And these are my classic recommendations. The slides I'm going to put online later, so don't necessarily worry about capturing it now. But these are my kind of fundamental, if you're like getting into, say, Java, Linux, or Unix programming, architecture, these are my sort of recommendations. Have them with you all the time, constantly read them, but don't necessarily, don't necessarily study them all out. But these are really good fundamental books. Evaluation is also super important in terms of methodologies, technologies, things like that we're using. And I want to share with you a quote about evaluation now, yeah? So the quote goes something like, "I'll postpone using this shiny new framework until my peers have validated the proposed benefits with rigorous scientific experiments." Now this was, of course, said by no programmer, ever. yeah? And I'm certainly guilty of that. You know, we like the shiny, we like the new thing, yeah? Docker, cloud, all cool stuff, but we just, you know, guilty as charged, we all get a bit too caught up on the hype. I had lunch with Adam Thornhill, a fascinating conversation actually, and he made the point, which is like a mic drop point, that we are a massively fad-driven industry. Yeah, things pop up, things go down, things pop up, things go down. Try to look at the fundamentals. Definitely as I've gone through my career and become a bit more senior or experienced, I rely a lot more on fundamentals and abstractions than I do on specific tech. So I learn more about architecture than I do, say, about Angular 2 or Redux, that kind of thing. The fundamentals allow you to apply sort of common patterns onto the new technologies. Yeah. I found things like Rabel's comparison matrix useful. Not useful for everything, but what you can do, here's an example here. Matt wrote an awesome blog post, link up the top, and he was comparing web frameworks. A few years ago now, Java frameworks, and he basically gave to his team a list of, they'd agreed on a list of criteria, and they went away separately and evaluated the tech, and then basically come back together and had a conversation. So it gave a bit more structure to the conversation. Rather than everyone bundling in saying, I like JSF, I like struts, they could have a more meaningful conversation about why they thought what they did. It's still subjective, obviously, but it gives a bit more objectivity in how we're evaluating. The cool thing is not only does it give a bit more structure with evaluation, but it also gives a documented record of why you chose what you did, which I think is really cool, yeah? As a consultant, I walk into many gigs and ask people, why have you got Rails? Why have you got Java? And most of the time, people don't know. They're like, it's here when I got here, or we're a Java shop, or we like Rails. By having this kind of thing as documentation, we can make better calls in the future because we realize where we've come from and what we valued at the time we made certain decisions. Does that make sense? I think it's really powerful both for evaluation and documentation. Right, next bias is optimistic bias. And this basically says that people tend to be overconfident, believing that they have substantial control in their lives. Yeah? And it's the I know what customers want type scenario. Yeah? How could I possibly be wrong? Yeah? Well, there's these things that affect basically optimistic bias. I'm not going to read through them all, but these are, I've put some notes in that you can download and have a look later. But desired end state, we like to think of positive outcomes. It just makes good sense, yeah? When we're building systems, we want to think the systems will be designed well, and we're often over-optimistic in what we can achieve. Even simple things like mood massively affect decisions. Yeah? So I've seen when people are in a really dark place, as a company, as individuals, they can make very different decisions versus when they've just got funded, for example, yeah? So I work with quite a few startups. Some of the worst decisions I've seen being made are when the company's just got money. Everyone's super happy, they're over-optimistic, we've secured all this money. And don't get me wrong, it's nice to celebrate achievements, but be aware that as humans, mood, even stuff going on in your family, these things can really affect decisions. And you have to stand up sometimes and say, look, I think this, but to be honest, I'm feeling really negative, or I'm having a bad day at work, or the baby woke me up. Those kind of things, yeah. It's okay as humans to say. I think in the IT industry, we're a bit macho at times. We don't say, hey, I'm having a hard time. These things might be affecting my decisions. It's all about thinking professionally again, defining and sharing clear goals of what we're trying to achieve as a team. So right from a business, through an architecture level, through a development level. Clear goals of what we're trying to achieve. And then iterate as fast as you can. Start small, build, measure, learn, keep going, yeah? I'll talk a bit more about the Big Bang thing later. But a lot of what I'm thinking sort of iterates or comes off of what Dan North says. Now, I'm sure people have heard of Dan North, awesome conference speaker, prolific writer as well. He's got this great presentation I've linked there called Patterns of Effective Delivery. And a key part of that is about removing uncertainty early. Looking at the project, looking at the business, looking at the technology, what can we spike early to remove the biggest set of uncertainty? It sounds really simple, but I've often seen many projects, in the haste to get started and to deliver business value, they tackle the easiest things first. Yeah? That may be valid in some contexts, but if it's a very uncertain project and there's a lot of risk, I would be cautious of that. removing some of this uncertainty early. Dan's got a whole bunch of patterns and techniques he recommends. This can be really valuable, yeah? It's something we have to work with management on again. We have to say maybe, first month is going to be spiking, it's going to be prototyping. The team don't know Docker, but we think it's super useful. Now, these are all conversations that potentially can be very valuable. Software is inherently collaborative. I mentioned that at the start, but I truly think this. The more companies I see, as a consultant, I'm very lucky. I see tens, probably hundreds of companies in my career. A lot of the problems are due to lack of collaboration, lack of communication, those kind of things. It's all about the people, bottom line. Big technique, a technique I'm a huge fan of is the Three Amigos technique. I'm not sure if people have heard of it in general. It comes from behavior-driven design, and it talks about when you're designing functionality in the application, you have at least 3 people. Doesn't have to be exactly 3, but at least 3, a business stakeholder, a developer, and a QA or tester. Because we all think very differently, and we're all incentivized very differently. Business is incentivized to get stuff out, developers usually get stuff out or write good code, QA are incentivized to not let bugs go through to production. But the fact we all think differently, often as a generalization, people in the different roles are wired differently in terms of thinking process. Having these people together is really useful when starting business functionality. Can be very lightweight, can be a 10-minute meeting. Maybe you produce some code, maybe some cucumber, gherkin syntax stuff at the end. You don't have to, though. The point being is getting the collaboration in early, increasing communication. When you start coding, I'm a massive fan of pair programming. Now, I don't always pair, and personally, sometimes I just like to do my own thing with the code, yeah? But pairing is super useful. It's really useful for knowledge transfer. Yeah, if I'm bringing a junior member on the team, or if I don't know a technology, pairing me up with someone else is a very effective way of knowledge transfer. A whole bunch of other benefits with pairing as well, but mob programming is super interesting. So I got introduced to this 2 years ago, and basically mob programming, you can see it on the bottom there, this is Unruly. Unruly are a company in the UK. They have one person driving and up to 10 people as passengers. Yeah? The driver is not allowed to think. The driver just types, but they rotate very fast, 5 or 10 minutes. So the driver is literally typing the commands, the team are brainstorming ideas and building it out, telling the driver what to write. I've actually took part in a couple of sessions. For certain problems, it is super useful. What I often find now in my consulting role, I find these kind of discussions still happen, even if you don't do mob programming, but they happen after the code's been written. Yeah? How many times have you written code, and then you go for a code review or something, and people start debating what you've done? Oh, I would have done it differently. Oh, that's inefficient. All valid points, but by doing it up front in a mob session, you get it out much earlier, and everyone learns. It seems really weird, and I'm asking you to kind of trust me on this one. Woody Zahill is a really awesome guy. Maybe get him here at the conference next year. Woody Zahill talks around this kind of stuff. But there's a bunch of references online, a couple of things there. This notion of mob programming to increase collaboration is really valuable when you're doing architecture, when you're doing development, I find. Same with kind of the DevOps stuff, yeah? So for me, DevOps is all about sharing pain. DevOps is developer operations. It's just about the coming together of sysadmins and developers, but not just technology. It's also accountability, things like that. So bear with me. This is a slightly strange analogy, but as a developer, there is a danger of having what's called safety culture. As a developer, I code my thing, I throw it over the wall, and QA and ops take the pain for me. Yeah? So I code my stuff, throw it over the wall. They get paged to fix it in the morning. They come and tell me what's gone on. It's a bit like airbags. Now, airbags in a car are a fantastic invention. They have saved countless lives, yeah? But there's an element of safety culture. People these days know that car safety is so good, allegedly it's possible they might drive more recklessly, yeah? Back in the day when there was no airbags, you might have thought twice about tailgating someone down the highway, these kind of things. Now, there's an argument that by removing some of the safety features, perhaps by putting a spike in the dashboard instead, you're going to think very differently about how you drive, yeah? Going down the freeway, and you're going to hit the brakes, and suddenly that spike's looking at you in the face. It's a bit different, yeah? Now, this for me is the notion of developer on call, yeah? Which I think is super important. If you write code, you should be responsible for it in production. This is not a popular sell when I go into organizations, yeah? Many developers literally say to me, I didn't sign up for this. I signed up to be a developer to write code. And my comeback is, you signed up to be a professional, you should clearly be accountable for what you're writing. And that is running it in production, yeah? And I've stolen this from people like Adrian Cockcroft and others like that. Netflix, Amazon do this kind of thing. Werner Vogels, the CTO of Amazon, famously said, you build it, you run it, yeah? Which for me is really powerful. Shared responsibility, communication, it also teaches you to write better code. So 5 years ago, I was on a team where I was being paid. I was a developer, Java developer, and I was on page duty for if stuff went wrong. I learned to write better code. I didn't like being woken up at 3 in the morning, yeah? So I definitely learned to write better code. I use things like circuit breakers, all that good stuff. So dialing back a little bit, a couple of recommendations. In terms of removing or limiting uncertainty, these are the books I recommend. Some business ones there in terms of trying to remove business uncertainty, and things like Extreme Programming, super good book. It's an old book, but basically, Extreme Programming, XP, is the good side of Agile, in my opinion. Agile in general became a bit of a project management fest. Yeah, Scrum, Kanban. They are very valuable techniques, but we missed the technical side of Agile. And XP, things like pairing, things like different techniques, is super useful. Some other business references for you there as well. A final thing on this one is watch for Hippo. I don't know if you've heard of Hippo. Hippo stands for the highest paid person's opinion. Yeah. So I get a lot of this in companies where we as developers come up with something, but a manager, someone who's paid more than us, will try and trump what we're saying, yeah? Trump there, no pun. What I mean is they will try and go, oh, basically, I think this. And people often quote Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs didn't look at metrics. And no, he didn't, but that's Steve Jobs, yeah? He's pretty much one of a kind. Most of us would benefit from looking at metrics. So running A/B testing, great talk actually by, I've forgotten his name there, guy from Uber, Mr. Mantis, I think it is, was from Uber. Metrics to Uber are as important as metrics in an aircraft, cockpit. He said basically if the Uber metrics disappear, they don't know what's going on. Much as if all your dials disappeared in an airplane, you'd be in crisis, wouldn't you? So rely on statistics, create the story, but base it on data. Don't default to the highest paid person's opinion. Switching it up a little bit, the planning fallacy is a phenomena in which predictions about how much time will be needed to complete a future task display an optimistic bias. So, was your last project completed on time? Maybe. And on budget? Anyone say project completed on time and on budget? Oh, there's always a couple. Good stuff. I need to chat to you afterwards. Very good. IT's track record in general isn't great. Yeah, and there's been in the US and the UK, and it's a global thing, yeah. These are just some of the examples I pulled off the website. Off the web, I should say. IEEE did a very interesting study. So IEEE are quite a nice kind of organization. They're very statistically rigorous, and their questionnaires they put out. And these were the most common factors for failure. And if you sort of look through, a lot of it is to do with planning, yeah. Stakeholder politics, and the use of immature technology, unmanaged risks. These things can be addressed with a bit more planning, I think. So what I found useful, and I'm conscious that I'm standing up here, I'm not necessarily an expert in this per se, but anecdotally, from my experience working over 15 years with various projects, these things I have found useful. Now, I generally work on medium to large size projects. I've done a few startups as well. But things like determining your goal or your hypothesis you're testing up front and defining metrics of success is very rare. Yeah, people do not actually know what success looks like often. Oh, we'll know it when we see it. Will you? Yeah, you might be rich or something. That's a good, if you've got stocks and shares in Google when you get rich, definite success. But we need to dial it back into smaller incremental chunks of, this is when I see this metric going up, conversion, number of people on the website, this is success for this part of the business problem, that kind of thing. And then you iterate, plan, do, check, showcase to the business, act, and keep going around that circle. Dividing and conquering has been really useful for me. I think the industry as a whole is moving towards this as well. Excuse me. Things with service-oriented architecture, the first kind of evolution of trying to divide up our architecture. realizing that we were creating software that was just too complex as one monolithic thing to understand. So I didn't get everything right, a lot of great stuff. So the vendors kind of messed it up a little bit, in my opinion. Microservices is the kind of second iteration of that. Driven by open source, driven by DevOps, driven by cloud. Docker is in the mix as well. You know, it's a nice way. They're definitely not a panacea, but they're a nice way of dividing up the problem. Yeah. Modules, like Simon talks a lot about that, Simon Brown, in terms of modularizing a system, componentizing your system. These things make good sense at a kind of software architecture level. Do be aware you have to knit them back together, hence the hat tip to systems thinking. We have to be very conscious that when we design a system made up of little components, it works together as a system. You can get behavior that's not expected. So in microservices, you can sometimes get what's called emergent behavior, where it kind of just is so many little things interacting, you get different results. So you need to think of the big picture, but work at the small picture as well. Spotify famously, carved up their teams into squads, guilds, and chapters. I'm pretty sure most of you have seen the Spotify model. This is probably an old slide in some ways. Be very clear here. Spotify are optimizing for autonomy and innovation. They are building a music streaming service. If they were building a nuclear reactor, they would do things very differently. Yeah. So I actually chatted to the Spotify people, and they said that. They said, we're not building heart pacemakers. We're building like stuff that if it falls over, no big deal. We are optimizing for autonomy and innovation and new things to market. But they have carved up their teams in very interesting ways. The notion of a tribe being responsible for something. And then you have these kind of like squads within a tribe, and that kind of like a bit like Scrum teams, but a bit more cross-functional. You have chapters going across. Chapters are kind of specialisms: QA, web development, Java development, Go development, these kind of things. And then you have this notion of guilds going across the thing, sharing knowledge. And guilds might be like lean principles, or good architecture, something like that. And they get together every month, say, and have a conference around these things. I won't talk too much onto it because there's plenty been written online, and many people have heard of Spotify for quite a while now. But it's that divide and conquer mentality, splitting the problem up, assigning appropriate people with appropriate skill sets to fix the problem. The beauty of the Spotify model is with their tribes, they don't have to create a lot of tickets. They want a new instance. They don't have to go, I've got to create a ticket in the ops tracker to create a new cloud server. They have people in the team that can do that for them. All about communication, all about collaboration, these kind of things. As a side note, even if your upfront planning is good, stuff inevitably goes wrong. Yeah, I've definitely seen this. And when things go wrong, people are always involved in the center of it, yeah? Now, I personally like to be this guy at the back, yeah? Kick him out with a beer, just, what's going on kind of thing. This for me is super important, but Mikey Dickerson, who was involved a lot in healthcare.gov, so healthcare.gov was the US healthcare system where you register for insurance. It was just a whole debacle. They had like 50 contractors, 50 contract companies building what is really an e-commerce website, and no one was responsible for knitting it together. So when the site went live, it fell over within seconds, and it took them like 3 months to get the site fully operational. And Mikey and his crack team, they sort of formed, apparently the president of the US actually formed, was on the phone forming this crack team of people from Google and Amazon and these kind of places. And they eventually figured out what went wrong. A lot of it was lack of shared ownership and lack of collaboration, but it was also about not recognizing some basic health things in terms of health of the system, and not recognizing the impact of people. Yeah. Excuse me. So one of the really funny things is Mikey went in, the first day he was called in, everything was on fire, the site was down, it was up, it was down, it was up, and he walks in with his team into the development team's room. And he said, clap his hands, all hands meeting. Right, I want to first off get a handle on the website. We need to see what the monitoring is, see what the performance is. How do the team here monitor things? And someone pointed to the corner of a room with like a monitor. And Mikey's like, awesome, probably it's Nagios or something. He looked up at that monitor and realized it was a television with the news channel on. And when CNN reported healthcare.gov was down, they rebooted the database. Yeah. That, bit of a fabled story, but Mikey sort of said this on a few times. It was genuinely that bad. They had no monitoring. So Mikey and his team, first thing they did was put in basic hygiene, basic monitoring, right from the host up through the application stack, just to get a handle of where they were. But after that basic monitoring, it was all about the people. How do we deal with incidents? How do we deal with post-mortems? One of the first things Mikey put in there was if you speak in a meeting, you only are allowed to speak if you help solve the problem. Before, he watched a couple of meetings, and all the meetings were shifting blame. Oh, that's not my team. I'm not responsible for that. The SLA doesn't do that. And he basically said, first thing, no one speaks unless you've got a solution. Yeah. So simple things like that, and then being honest as to where they went wrong so they can fix it in the future. These things seem really obvious, but when you're in the thick of it, can be really hard to figure out sometimes. So from the macro and the micro, these things, I found these books really useful. Excuse me. So user story mapping in terms of trying to remove some of the uncertainty. Drifting into failure, systems thinking are more about how to work with bigger systems, things like that, are really interesting books. Adrian Cockcroft recommended them to me. They're a really good book. In terms of estimation, that's an awesome book, thinking about estimations a little bit more. Hat tip to Simon, see Simon's in the back there. That was his original cover of his book. Thinking about software architecture, componentization, modularization, super important for all these kind of planning things, yeah. And lastly, about when you're building teams, this is the Google book, Laszlo Bock, on how to build, or how Google build teams. I'm not saying we should all copy Google, but I found it a really interesting read and learnt a lot about not only how to build my teams, but how to make sure everyone is working at their kind of best and how I can train my people, train my team, so that we all get something out of the journey together. It was a really kind of cool book. Last thing in terms of the planning stuff is, excuse me, you do have to accept unknown unknowns. I'll let you quickly read that while I drink water. This is obviously a bit of a joke, but it's really important that stuff is going to be outside of your control. Don't beat yourself up about it, basically. Do have a think about the planning fallacy. Do try and break stuff down. Do be iterative, but, stuff happens sometimes, yeah? So I think might be the final one, or one more final, is the sunk cost fallacy. Excuse me, I'm going to have to cough. I'm talking too much today already. And this basically says any past cost that has already been paid and cannot be recovered should not be figured into future decision-making process. Yeah. So what I'm going to ask you is, when did you last remove a framework from your project or your library? Yeah. This, it's a real challenge, and I've totally been there on this kind of stuff as well. Why are we reluctant? Well, basically, we don't like being wrong. Yeah, it's a human thing. There's something called the endowment effect. When we own something, be it from like material goods through to architectures, we assign more value to it. Yeah, and existing effort appears to be wasted if we were to throw away something. Yeah. Loss aversion, this comes from Thinking Fast and Slow. Loss aversion is also twice as powerful psychologically as gains. Yeah. So if you imagine if you open your wallet, you leave the building today, you open your wallet, and 100 euros flies out. That is really damaging. Yeah? You'd be like, oh my God, 100 euros gone. Now, if you won 100 euros the next day, or as in forget you'd lost it for a second, if you won, there'd still be a great win. Oh, got 100 euros. But just think for a minute, the loss is typically more powerful. If you have something and you lose it, versus getting something, yeah? And this is the same kind of thing. We're loss averse as humans. The basic thing is try not to sink costs, yeah? We're hopefully moving away from the kind of waterfall days where we did these big upfront decisions, and we're moving more towards iteration. So this is the OODA loop on the right there, but we're deliberately trying not to put big costs into the project by iterating as fast as we can with a limited kind of blast radius. Yeah, we're no longer choosing, say, an ESB technology, which basically that technology is going to be pervasive throughout our system. I've worked on a few of those systems where they spent sometimes years evaluating technology to go into a project. And that is really dangerous when it turns out in a year's time, the technology is no longer good. No one wants to remove it. It's going to cost way too much money, they think. People have staked their careers sometimes on these things. So don't get into the place in the first place is my advice. Very challenging sometimes, of course. But sometimes you just have to make the call. We were wrong. What can we do to get better? I like these books. The Mary Poppin-Dieck, really good stuff around lean. Agile Retrospectives, really good book. There's this notion in Agile of the last responsible moment. And this is quite a powerful kind of an analogy of when looking back on something in a project, when was the last moment we could have made a decision and still been responsible? That makes sense? So quite often we make decisions up front, and we know really we could have made them further down the line. Conversely, I see a lot of people deferring things like non-functional requirements, like security, to too late down. The last responsible moment for security and scalability is often up front in the project, but people sort of push it away thinking, oh, I'll figure out that stuff later. But Mary's book goes into a lot of detail around this notion of when is the last responsible moment. Some people also talk about options. So if you come from a financial background, kind of option theory, in terms of you buy options now so that in the future, when they're right, you can strike on that option. So sometimes I say a lot of good architecture choices are about giving yourself the right options. We don't necessarily build in too much abstraction now. We don't build in lots of stuff that's not needed, but we build in the kind of points in the system where we can change things if necessary later. Option kind of points. How can we learn? How can we get better? These are the fundamental things, yeah. So I think this is the final one now, and it talks about anchoring bias. And I'm sure you recognize this one. It's the common tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information given when making decisions, yeah. So how does your manager ask for estimates? Is a classic, yeah. Is it an unbiased question, or is it something like this? Yeah. You're basically anchoring the developer there on that it's going to be ready in 2 weeks. Yeah, and particularly junior developers, I've been there as a junior developer, when my manager said that to me and I knew it was going to take 4 weeks, because I'd been anchored on the 2 weeks, I would often go, well, it might take 3. Do you know what I mean? That anchoring is very powerful. That's why managers do it, obviously, but use your superpowers for good, not for bad. Knowing that now, you basically don't do this kind of thing, yeah? And if you are on the receiving end of it, we have to learn to what's called upwardly manage, yeah? Say no is a key thing, yeah? Providing, clearly you don't just say no and walk away. You need to provide explanations and alternatives, but there's some notion of, definitely in my career, when I started saying no to things and giving justification, I got a lot more respect as an architect, yeah? It's like, no, we can't change that because of these things. Or yes, we can change it, but it's going to push the project back by, 2 months or something. It comes back to, again, really, to making sure goals and user stories are well defined. Yeah, we know what we're building, these kind of things, and really the management then should have a better idea of how long things are going to take to build. If you have to estimate, I'm a big fan of the PERT systems, and PERT is basically tri-point estimates. Excuse me, you give a nominal kind of estimate, you give a best case and a worst case. So I think it'll take 5 days, best case 2 days, worst case 10 days. And you can do some kind of statistical deviations and so forth, and do some quite funky stuff. The link there, I believe, goes to Uncle Bob, Robert Martin's website, where he talks in more detail about the PERT estimation scheme. If you absolutely have to estimate, it's much better than just giving one number. Because just giving one number, as in 2 days, 3-story points, these kind of things, is quite fixed in stone, yeah? On that note, I'm a big fan, actually. There's a movement called the no estimates movement. It's kind of, if you look on Twitter, hashtag no estimates, it's kind of a kickback into the classical estimation. So I'm sure many of you are using like these kind of story cards to do estimations, those kind of things. Yay or nay? Yeah, a few people, cool. 1 second. They can be very valuable. So we go around the room, basically, we're working on a piece of functionality. We individually ascribe a point value using the card to that story. And then we all basically show our hands. And we say, I think it's a 2, or you think it's a 10. That's a cue for a discussion as to, why we think things are different. The challenge is, when you've got this many numbers, like what's the difference between a 20, a 40, and a 100? And my 100 might be different than your 100. Yeah, it's not, it's quite challenging when you're trying to estimate things in this notion. Now, the no estimates movement have got their own, planning poker deck, but it's a much simpler deck. Yeah, it's basically 3 cards. It's either 1 story point, or it's 2 flipping big, or no flipping clue. Yeah. Which I think is quite nice. So what they're advocating there is breaking things down into manageable chunks that are all roughly the same size. Not always possible, but it is a bit better than trying to go, whenever I see any story bigger than, say, 13 in the old way, I get nervous, because I know that, like, as an architect, as a team leader, 13 could actually be 100. We probably don't know. This is a kind of nice notion of it's just too flipping big. We need to carve the scope back of the story, yeah? So they're a bit of jokey kind of cards, but I like the idea of trying to carve stuff up rather than adapting our planning process to compensate for not dividing things up. So reading your way to like kind of tech leadership in this space, because anchoring is something that requires, I think, strong tech leadership to push back. Pat's book, I'm sure many of you have seen Pat already talk today. Pat's awesome book. These other books I found useful in my journey, having like good conversations, knowing what craftsmanship is. Sandro's book's really cool there. But just getting a sort of more fundamental understanding of what my responsibilities are as a leader and how I can push back in a professional way when people try and anchor me on certain figures, these kind of things. So we are coming to the final bit now. So let's just wrap this up, yeah? I've done this talk a few times at other different conferences, and I've actually put this slide in now, because one thing people asked me on the first couple of times was, you seem to be very negative for System 1. I'm advocating that you should engage System 2 more. And that's true, but System 1 is awesome. Yeah? These two books are really interesting books for reading a bit more about the benefits of System 1. And System 1 basically kept us safe right from our early evolutionary days. Tiger's face, you're running kind of thing. That was System 1 in action. And it does the same for us today. Walk out in the street, car comes through, you're running, System 1 saves us. And it even saves us in IT at times, yeah. It's that kind of gut feel. One thing, though, is System 1 gets better the more experienced you are. So there's definitely things as a consultant now, I get a gut feel, and I try and validate these things, but I'm getting increasingly better at these things. So for example, one thing is recognizing problem people in a team. So as a consultant, I've seen probably hundreds of teams, yeah. Now I can quite quickly, after an hour's conversation with the team, figure out the problem person. And it's not always the loudest person. Like sometimes, there's subtle things I pick up on. But if you don't have much experience or expertise, System 1 can try and trick you at times, yeah. You think you know more than you do. So System 1 becomes more valuable the more experienced you get. This kind of notion of deliberate learning as well, if you want to learn more about those things, are quite good. You can use System 1 for good as well, and Nudge talks about that. Nudge is a famous story about how Google tried to get their teams to eat more healthy by putting the healthy snack food at eye level. So when people walked into the kitchen, they'd go, ooh, apple. And they still provided chocolates, but they were down below. Simple little System 1 nudges like that can actually be really powerful. And there's nudges you can do like that in the code, but you can also use it for evil, yeah? I've said it already, use your superpowers for good, yeah? Knowing that System 1 exists, your choice whether you exploit it for good or bad, but I'd say do it for good, yeah? I still think I see too much System 1 in IT. Yeah, people jump to conclusions way too quickly. They trust their gut when they haven't got much experience, these kind of things. And I've done it as well. Hands up, yeah, on that one. We all make mistakes, yeah? We're basically not robots. Some of us in IT like to think we're very logical. Yeah, we are, but we have emotions, we have good days, we have bad days, and we're prone to make so many biases, or we're prone to make mistakes. Just who we are. It's the beauty of being human, yeah? We do tend to work better as a social species. Yeah? This again comes from evolutionary terms. You could hunt bigger game and increase your survival if you collaborated with your neighbors on the savannah, these kind of things. Same in IT. The notion of being a hero, I think, hopefully is disappearing. Anyone who's read the kind of Phoenix Project, these things, we need to come together more, and things like DevOps are a kind of reaction to this, the notion of increasing collaboration and kind of shared responsibility. I would recommend building your kind of toolbox as well. And not just tools as in software tools, but as in patterns and things you apply. It's definitely something I've really worked on as a consultant. I see certain patterns all the time, and there's certain things I do now to explore those patterns. So I've built a kind of toolbox. Saying to Adam over lunch, actually, things as a consultant I've got a lot more confident, sort of interested in general in terms of the value I can add, but mainly that's from listening a lot closer. And I've got really good at asking questions. Big part of my toolbox is saying, why do you make that decision? What's your background? What's your motivations? Yeah. As a consultant, I can often ask the dumb kind of questions, but it's really good for building that understanding, building the empathy of why the person is making the decisions they are. Because often people might be making crazy decisions, but when you empathize with their goals, their background, their incentives, it's a lot easier to understand why they're making those decisions. And on that note, empathy is super, super important. Yeah, I think it's my pet project at the moment. I've got another talk that's online you can check out just purely on the benefits of empathy within software development. But I'm going to leave you having a quick read of this one before the final slides. This is what empathy is all about, yeah? Not jumping to conclusions. When I read that, I was like, oh, that's harsh. Oh, that's true. Oh, that's harsh. But you get my point. As developers, we often jump very quickly. As architects, we jump very quickly. Oh, the QA people aren't as talented as us, or oh, the architects don't know what they're doing, and vice versa. Yeah, we're all imperfect in some ways. But empathize with the person, empathize with the team. Final sort of quote I'm going to share is, I put up a lot of books and stuff, and if anyone follows me on Twitter, you know I go to a lot of conferences. For me, this quote from Charlie Tremendous Jones says it all. You're going to be the same person pretty much in 5 years as you are today, except for the books you read and the people you meet. Yeah, I messed up the quote a little bit, but you get the idea. You can be the same person in 5 years as you are today, except for the people you meet and the books you read. Yeah. Now, it's a bit nuanced. Someone joked the other day and said it depends on the amount of donuts you eat as well, these kind of things. But you get the point, yeah, in terms of this stuff is super important. And that's why I like coming to conferences and chatting to all these, all you awesome people, and it's why I like reading books as well, yeah. As in, these are the conferences I presented this talk at. They've turned at the top, woo, of course. And these are books that were really sort of influential in my career, over my career. So I highly recommend these. A bit of a gem on these books is the pragmatic thinking and learning. It basically taught me how to learn, which is really valuable, yeah? And like speed reading, memory, sort of mind maps, these things are really valuable for a lot of the stuff I've talked about today. A lot of my value as a consultant is about applying models as appropriate, yeah? Recognizing when to do certain things. This is just a mind map. This is not my work. This is from the book directly, but it talks about, if you're trying to learn more efficiently, you need to learn deliberately, debug your mind, look after yourself. How do you journey from like a novice to an expert? All these, the Dreyfus model, all these kind of good things. But it's a really awesome book. Highly recommend checking this book out. So in summary, apply process and models as appropriate. Do respect system 1, super useful. But engage system 2 as appropriate, yeah? And use various tools to do that. Collaborate more and collaborate better. Super easy, super valuable, this kind of stuff. And then this notion of iteration. Learn, do, retrospect, teach, repeat. Those kind of things, yeah? I just love iterating, but I do find some of the best ways to understand something is to teach it. Hence why I do a lot of these talks. Like putting this talk together a year ago now was me basically trying to really learn about thinking fast and slow. Yeah? And I find if you teach something, whatever it is, be it Docker, be it this kind of stuff, you really have to understand it. So I try and in my spare time do some teaching as well. And I find like I get as much out of it as students do. Really valuable stuff. But this notion of continually improving, set your goals, set your hypothesis, continually improve. Bottom line is, in our day-to-day jobs, it's very easy to get into autopilot. But I'm going to ask you to try and think a little bit more deliberately. Think back to that joke I did with the image, yeah? We almost all fell for that. Try and think a bit more deliberately. On that note, thank you very much. I'm done. This thing. I'll be around the rest of the conference. If you don't want to ask now, I'll definitely be around. Oh, we got. Oh,
Hola. I don't know, just about these things, System 1 and System 2, you were speaking about that. And System 2 naturally requires a lot of effort and energy. And why we fall back to System 1 is when we're tired, exhausted, or working for like 2 or 3 hours. How would you recommend to manage your energy levels, or like how to take risks or something to engage in system 2 more, because that's beneficial, of course.
That's a great question, and I'll be honest in that I've never been asked that before, in terms of system 2 does take more energy, no doubt about it. So how do we keep that energy up? And there's a couple of things I can say, is one, mix in kind of autopilot work, as well as doing system 2 work. So for example, for me, like architecture might be more system 2, development more system 1, these kind of things. That's definitely something to do. The second is try and avoid unnecessary decisions. So there's this notion of decision fatigue, yeah? If you're spending a lot of your system 2 energy on stuff that probably isn't important, try and remove those things. So famously, Steve Jobs, President Obama, same thing in the States, wore the same clothes every day to minimize the decision of what to wear. Now, that seems a bit trivial, but as in, like, people are those, like President Obama, pretty overloaded with ideas. So it's all about focusing on where you can add the most value with your system 2 work, and then just managing your personal energy. So yeah, in terms of mixing in perhaps system 2 work at the beginning of the day, try and do some autopilot work, system 2 stuff around lunch, those kind of things.
All right, thanks.
Cool. Question? Oh, good. Any questions? I have a suggestion then. So basically there's something that is called mindfulness nowadays. So like the mindfulness movement. So how can you apply your probably the consciousness decision making model to your life? It's about being aware of the moment, right? And seeing what happens around. So you can Google it, mindfulness.
Totally recommend that, Edward. So I'm actually very lucky at university, got into Buddhism a little bit. I'm definitely not, I wouldn't say I'm Buddhist, but I learned about mindfulness, and it's definitely helped me to focus on the problem. So a lot of mindfulness is, like you do breath, counting, these kind of things. It's trying to focus on what's important, rather than all the, I'm mentally quite a busy person. I'm constantly thinking, what's for dinner? Oh, I should say that, all these kind of things. But trying to focus on one thing trains the mind to be a bit more focused. I personally found that really useful. Yeah.
Questions? No questions?
Not a problem.
Okay, let's have a break then and see you.
Thanks, Ed.